broadcast, I'm talking about how to let God's kind of love flow through you, how to resolve a problem between you and another person. And today I'm going to give you 4 possible reasons why relationships don't work. You've got to diagnose the situation properly to get the right results. Stay tuned.
Welcome to Gospel Truth with Andrew Wommack, a teaching ministry that emphasizes God's unconditional love and grace. And now, here's Andrew.
Welcome to our Thursday's broadcast of the Gospel Truth. Today I'm nearing the end of my 2nd week teaching on a subject that I've entitled God's Kind of Love Through You. In the summer I taught a series on God's kind of love to you, talking about how He loves you unconditionally. Now we're talking about how to take that unconditional love of God and show it towards other people. And I've covered this for 2 weeks. There's actually 9 parts to this teaching on God's kind of love through you. And I've already covered about how important walking in love is. I used a lot of scripture on that. I've talked about you can't give away what you don't have. So I emphasized briefly how that you need to first of all receive God's kind of love before you can give it away to others. And then the last couple of days, I've started talking about, now how do you walk in love towards other people? And the first points that I've made so far in this 3rd part of this 9-part teaching is that you need to be realistic and recognize you can't get along with everyone. And you need to even recognize that sometimes God is the one who wants to put an end to a relationship. I think that's important, and I talked about that yesterday. That will factor into some of the things that I'm going to be talking about today. So we've already covered all of this. Now we're talking about actually putting all of this into a practice. Let's say that you are having conflict in a relationship with another person, and this doesn't matter. This will apply to all relationships. This isn't limited to marriage. It isn't limited to family. It isn't limited to work or a neighbor, but it applies to all of those things. Any person that you're having problems in your relationship with, here's basically the steps that I believe you need to go through about how to deal with this and how to resolve this situation. The first step when you have a problem in a relationship is you've got to evaluate what is the cause of that problem. Now that's really simple, but this is not so easy to do, and I think that most people make a mistake right here in this very first step, the analysis process, and if you diagnose the thing incorrectly, you're going to get the wrong results. See, it would be similar to if you have something physically wrong in your body. Let's say that you have a pain in your chest. And if you, just for whatever reason, you say you've lived with the fear that you've had a history of heart problems or something like this, and so you have a pain in your chest, and because other people in your family have had this, you just self-diagnose, and you think, oh man, I know that this is heart problems, and so you start taking something to lower your blood pressure, or you start self-medicating, or you start speaking wrong. You know, if you have diagnosed the wrong thing, maybe it's indigestion. Maybe it's the fact that you aren't eating well and that you've done something and you're having indigestion and you think it's heart problems. Did you know that, of course, if you believe the wrong thing and get into fear about this, that would release Satan into your life, and you could wind up having a serious heart problem when it wasn't that at all, but your fear allowed that thing in. Or you could start taking wrong medication. And anyway, I think you understand my point, that you've got to accurately diagnose what the problem is in order to get the proper treatment. And it's the same thing in relationships. When you have problems in a relationship, you have to diagnose what is the source of this problem. And if you don't diagnose it correctly, you are going to come up with the wrong answer. And of course, it's just not going to work. And I bet you every person watching this program, regardless of where you are in the world, knows someone who was incorrectly diagnosed, or they self-diagnosed a physical problem in their life. They took some medication, and you know what? There's people that die from that. And I bet you every one of us knows somebody who died because of a misdiagnosis, a mistreatment or something like that. The diagnosis stage of what is the problem is probably just as important as the application about how do I solve this and how do I fix it. So I say the same thing. When it comes to walking in love with other people, if you have strife in between you and another person, You've got to accurately diagnose what is causing this problem. And the way that I see it, I'm sure that other people would teach this differently, but this is just, I'm trying to get things as simple as I can. There's only 4 possible sources of what is causing this problem. And I'll go through and mention these, and then I'll come back and we'll deal with each one individually and start talking about this. But the first thing to consider is, are you the problem? Now, I'm going to have a lot to say about that, but you know, very few people would consider this the very first thing, and yet I'm going to show you some scriptures that this ought to always be your first consideration. You ought to always examine yourself before you go to looking to see if somebody else is the problem. Most of us are, just in a sense, blinded to the fact that we could ever be the problem. We think that everybody else is always the problem, and our society has put a tremendous emphasis on this, that we're all victims, and it's because of the way I was treated in my dysfunctional family. And psychology today recognizes the potential damage of us living in guilt and shame over something that we've done. So rather than teach the grace of God and the forgiveness of God to deal with this shame, what they've basically done is said that, no, it's not me, it's everybody else that's my problem. I'm a product of my environment, and I don't have any responsibility for the jerk that I am. It's somebody else who made me this way. I tell you, that is a godless answer to a problem, and it's a godless attempt to try and deal with problems. The right way is to evaluate what the problem is. And one of the options, I believe the first option we ought to take is, am I the problem? And if you're the problem, rather than live with the guilt and the shame and the problem of it, well, go to the Lord. Receive your forgiveness. Go to the other person. Humble yourself and get forgiveness and deal with that. But that ought to be the first place you look. Am I the problem? The second place is the other person the problem? And we're going to be talking about that, and we're going to go into a lot of lengthy things about how do you deal with it if the other person is the problem. The third option, which I believe is probably what it normally is, this is probably the truth, is it both of you? It's not usually one-sided. Maybe somebody started it, but you know what, most of the time we've reacted also. And so in most of the cases, it's going to be a combination of it's you and them. And here's the fourth option, and this is something that most people don't think about. When you're trying to resolve differences with another person, is God the one that is putting an end to this relationship? Now again, I've already mentioned this briefly, but some people just, well, no, God would never do that. Well, I've already used the scriptures over in 2 Corinthians chapter 6 where the Lord told us, don't be unequally yoked together with unbelievers. And I've used this example that, you know, sometimes people are trying to marry a person that God doesn't want you to marry. And so you're praying, oh God, help us to love each other. You know, we've had a fight last night. Help us to get over it. What do I do? And you're trying to make this relationship work, and God's trying to put an end to it because that is not the right person for you. There are business deals. The Lord told you not to be unequally yoked together with unbelievers, and that not only applies in marriage, but I believe that in business. You know, sometimes you put yourself at the mercy of a person whose values are ungodly, and Satan is going to have access to you because you are unequally yoked together with a person who is just given over to Satan. And so try as you may to make this business venture work, it's not going to work because the other person is given over to the devil. And you know what? God may be leading you to go out and start something on your own or go to a different job site. There could be a multitude of applications of this, but I do believe that there are instances where God is the one trying to put an end to a relationship. And sometimes not because, you know, you just don't share any of the same values. I can show you examples, and I'll be talking about this later as we go through this. But I can show you that when I first got turned on to the Lord, the people who were present with me, we became so tight with each other. We actually loved each other. And we were so dependent that we actually became codependent on each other. I couldn't hear God's voice by myself. It's like I respected these other people, that we were together all day, every day, And it actually became nearly an unhealthy relationship where we were codependent upon another person, not on God. I was leaning on these other friends of mine more than I was leaning on God. And you know, for a period of time, there was kind of an incubation period of time where that was helpful in my life. But then I got drafted. I went to Vietnam. I had to learn how to just relate directly to God. And when I got back out of Vietnam, did you know I had grown differently than my other friends had grown? And even though we still loved each other, even though we still respect each other, I just couldn't make that relationship get back to where it was before because we had grown apart. And I don't think that that's always bad. We still love each other. Now, I'm not talking about that God wants to cause division and separation and that God is the author of hatred. That's not what I'm talking about. We don't hate each other. We still love each other. But we just needed to go on. We needed to grow. It was not good. You know, Jesus' disciples saw him transfigured and they wanted to build 3 tabernacles, Matthew chapter 17, and just camp there. And no, they needed to come down off that mountain and take the things that they had seen and heard and learned and share them with other people. Sometimes people just want to get together with nothing but their best friends, and yet God wants you to go out and reach the world. And I believe that God could actually put an end to a relationship, not in the sense that He kills it or makes you hate each other, but He could just take His blessing away from that for the purpose of you moving on and getting on and doing what He wants you to do. So you need to evaluate, is it you? Is it them? Is it both of you? Is it God that's causing this break in this relationship? Now that needs a lot more explanation, and I'm going to talk about all of those things, but I want to take a break here and ask my announcer to share with you about how to get these materials, because I'm sharing some really practical things here that could make a big difference in your life. So please listen to our announcer. Please take advantage of these materials that we're offering, and then I'll be right back after this break to continue the gospel truth.
Andrew's 9-part teaching titled God's Kind of Love Through You is available on CD for a gift of £30 or more. The third individual CD in the album is available for a donation of £3. But to those unable to send a gift, Andrew and his partners will provide this third CD free of charge. Or you can receive the full album as part of the God's Kind of Love 5-pack for a gift of £60 or more. The 5-pack includes God's Kind of Love Through You, God's Kind of Love to You, and God's Kind of Love, The Cure for What Ails You. 2 companion books complete the 5-pack, The True Nature of God and Spirit, Soul, and Body. Request the God's Kind of Love 5-pack when you write, call, or go to our website. We hope to hear from you today. And now, Gospel Truth continues.
So I was talking about that if there is a problem between you and someone else and you want to let God's kind of love flow through you towards them and reconcile this situation, first of all, you have to diagnose what is causing this problem. And I gave 4 options. Is it you? Is it them? Is it both of you? Is it God? Now, first of all, let's go back and look at this. And here's the reason that I believe the very first thing we ought to consider is, have we contributed to this division, to this strife in this situation? You ought to first of all examine yourself. Here's what Jesus said in Matthew chapter 7 in verse 1. Judge not that ye be not judged. For with what judgment you judge, you shall be judged, and with what measure you mete, it shall be measured to you again. And why beholdest thou the mote that is in thy brother's eye, but considerest not the beam that is in thine own eye? Or how wilt thou say unto thy brother, Let me pull out the mote out of thine eye, and behold, a beam is in thine own eye? You hypocrite, first cast out the beam out of thine own eye, and then shall you see clearly to cast out the mote of thy brother's eye. Boy, that is a powerful passage of Scripture. There's a lot of misunderstanding about the things that are said here. Sometimes people use this to say, well, you shouldn't judge. You should never have an opinion. You should never pass judgment on anything. You know, there's other Scriptures where the Lord told pastors that you have to judge in these situations, like over in 1 Corinthians chapter 5. I'm going to talk about this later, He says, judge your own selves. You have to judge certain things. He told pastors in the book of Revelation, chapter 2 and chapter 3, he says, I'm going to bring judgment on you if you don't judge this ungodliness that's going on in your church. You know, if you take these scriptures in Matthew chapter 7, verses 1 and 2, judge not that you be not judged. This isn't speaking against judgment, it's speaking against wrong type of judgment. You can't live your life without making judgments, without making a discernment. You know, if you are out late at night and if you have a car that, say for instance, you have a flat tire or something, and somebody pulls up behind you, and if you see all of these people get out with knives and guns and chains and they come rushing towards you, you know what? You need to make a judgment. You may be wrong. You don't know for sure what their motive is, but you know what? It would be to your advantage to think, I probably ought to get out of here, or I at least ought to lock the doors, or maybe it'd be better to drive off on the rim and ruin my tire than to let all of these people mug me. You know what? If you say that, oh no, I'd never judge, you can't live that out practically. No, there are times that you need to make a judgment. You need to make a judgment. Say, for instance, if you're single and somebody comes on to you and all of a sudden you have to make a judgment. Do I want to open up and be friendly to this person, or do I want to stop this right here? You need to make a judgment. I have to make judgments all the time. All of us make judgments. This isn't saying that you can't judge. It just says be careful the judgment that you'd make, because the same way that you judge others is the way that you'll be judged yourself. That's the point that's being made. And then the very next thing he says is, before you go to judging somebody else, first of all, judge yourself. Are you the problem? Why are you trying to pick this little tiny speck out of another person's eye, their little tiny problem, when you have this huge beam, 4 by 4, sticking out of your own eye? You know, what a graphic picture this is. And Jesus basically is saying, before you try and get this little speck out of somebody else's eye, you better deal with this huge beam that's in your own eye. And I tell you, this is played out 1,000,000 times every day. I have a lot of people come to me, and a lot of what they're talking about is how to resolve differences. How do I get along with this person, whether it's your mate or whether it's somebody at work or somebody here in the ministry, or, you know, most problems that people come with are really relational problems. And in the vast majority of cases, they come in telling me what the other person has done. And yet I would say probably in the majority of cases, not that the other person hasn't done something wrong, but what the other person has done is insignificant in comparison to what that individual is doing. And I tell you, if people would just do what this says right here, if the very first thing, when there is problems between you and somebody else, if you would humble yourself, and this is really what it takes, and this is the reason that so few people, first of all, consider themselves, is because it takes humility for you to consider, am I the problem? God, have I caused this problem? Is this something that is my own doing? It takes humility to focus that. Most people don't even like to consider this. Most people can't handle it. You know, as a matter of fact, I forget all of the details of this, but I was recently talking about something along these lines, and I had a person come up to me and says, I couldn't even consider that I'm the problem. I couldn't face it, because if I was the problem, how would I ever live with myself? This person was so insecure that they couldn't ever face the fact that maybe they were the source of the problem. And I tell you, there's a lot of people like this today. There's a lot of people that aren't secure enough to honestly, objectively evaluate a situation and say, God, am I the problem? To ask that and then be serious enough that if God told you, yes, you're the problem, that you would accept it and deal with it. There's a lot of people today that just don't even have this on their radar. They would never ask this question. They couldn't handle it because the only way they live with themselves is to make themselves always the victim. They are never the person who is victimizing another. They just don't ever go there. They don't think that way. And yet, this is what Jesus is saying. You have to, first of all, consider yourself. Are you the problem? You got to deal with this huge beam coming out of your eye before you start looking for the minute problems in somebody else. Boy, that's powerful. That is powerful, powerful, powerful. And let me just give you some other details about this. You know, as we go on to step number 2, if the other person is the problem, you go talk to them. If you would, first of all, before you even get into whether they're the problem, if you would deal with yourself, did you know that this would solve a large percentage? I have no way of putting an exact number on this, but I tell you, this would solve a lot of things. Seldom ever is the other person the only problem. Even if they have a problem, even if they have wronged you and done something to you, often, most of the time, you have played a part in it. And if you would just deal with yourself, you know what? You would see most relationships straighten out. They would iron out. Things would work out if you would just deal with yourself. You know, again, I go back to a testimony that I used last week, but about 2 of our Bible college students that had, you know, a lot of problems in marriage, and Jamie and I talked to them. And then after 2 years of being in Bible school, I was talking to one of them and asking how the marriage was, and he said, "Oh, it's wonderful, it's great." And I said, "What was the difference?" And it wasn't teaching on marriage. It wasn't that they had gotten marriage counseling. It wasn't that they sat down and hashed out all of their problems. You know what they did? They went to God and they got their own life straightened out. And they started receiving an unconditional love of God for them, and just automatically, as they got set free and started walking in love, as they got the beam out of their own eye, then you know what? The relationship improved. And he was telling me that they have a great marriage now. And it wasn't because of anything specifically dealing with the other person and stuff. It was each one of them got their eyes on the Lord and started walking in the love of God, and things worked out. I'm telling you that if you would, first of all, take care of yourself before you try and take care of anybody else, you would find out that this is a great way to live. For one thing, you're the only person that you really have authority over. And I'm saying this even in marriage. Some people will teach that, boy, you can... I've had people come to me, how can I make my mate love me? How can I make my mate, you know, not go out and go hunting and leave me and do all of these kind of things? How can I make these things happen? You don't have the authority to make your mate do anything. I actually saw a tape one time that says 7 steps to changing your mate. And I listened to it, gave the person the benefit of the doubt, but you know, basically it was witchcraft. God doesn't tell you how to manipulate and make your mate do certain things. The Scripture teaches you to love your mate unconditionally. And then it says, how do you know, O man, whether you will save your wife? Or how do you know, O wife, whether you will save your husband? Out of 1 Corinthians chapter 7. It isn't a guarantee, but if you would just take care of yourself and love your mate and treat them properly, well, you're going to release the power of God towards them, and they have a choice whether they accept it or not. You can't, there is nothing that you can manipulate and make your mate change. That's the way the demonic realm operates. That's witchcraft, where you cast a spell and make them do something against their will. No, that's not the way that God's kind of love works. God doesn't tell you how to change your mate. He just tells you how to change yourself. If you would deal with yourself, if your wife was living with Jesus, or if your husband was living with Jesus, if they were living with somebody, if your wife lived with somebody who treated her like a queen, if the wife lived with a man who treated her like a king, you know what, in the majority of cases, that would solve the problem right there. It's not about how to change your mate. You don't have the authority or the power to change your mate. Your authority ends at the end of your nose. You ought to deal with yourself. You ought to deal with what's wrong with you, and that's what these verses are saying. First of all, look at the beam coming out of your own eye before you try and deal with the little speck in somebody else's eye. So you need to analyze, you need to diagnose what's the problem, and you need to start with considering, am I the problem? And if you're the problem, then I'll give you some steps on our program tomorrow about how you begin to deal with this. But I tell you, this is really practical stuff. This would change your life. It would change your relationships if you would operate what I'm talking about. I really would like to encourage you to get these materials. I think that this could help you tremendously. So please listen as our announcer gives you this information. Please call or write today and get these materials, and then make sure you join me again tomorrow for the Gospel Truth.
Andrew's 9-part teaching titled God's Kind of Love Through You is available on CD for a gift of £30 or more. The third individual CD in the album is available for a donation of £3. But to those unable to send a gift, Andrew and his partners will provide this third CD free of charge. Or you can receive the full album as part of the God's Kind of Love 5-pack for a gift of £60 or more. The 5-pack includes God's Kind of Love Through You, God's Kind of Love To You, and God's Kind of Love, The Cure for What Ails You. 2 companion books complete the 5-pack, The True Nature of God and Spirit, Soul, and Body. Request the God's Kind of Love 5-pack when you write, call, or go to our website. We hope to hear from you today.
I know that many of you are just rejoicing in your heart to have somebody on television saying these real practical things. You know how it has changed your life. You know how it could benefit other people. And you know, I'm trying to reach as far as I possibly can with these truths. I believe that this will help people in any culture, any country in the world. And we're literally broadcasting all over the world. But there's so much more that I want to do. But to do it, I need people to join with me on a monthly basis. Our bills come in on a monthly basis, and we can't take these opportunities unless we know that we're going to be able to pay the bills. So we have a number on your screen. I'd like to encourage you to pray and then call and become a partner with us today. You know, I'm offering this God's Kind of Love 5-pack that'll give you a lot more information on this subject of love. But really, one of the best resources that I have is our website. We have about 400 of my teachings that are available as free downloads on this website. I also have about 7 years worth of my television programs, about 10 years worth of our radio programs. We have books, we have articles that I've written. All of these things are available free of charge. It's a tremendous resource material. So we have that address on your screen. Please join us at awme.net.
Be sure to tune in tomorrow for more gospel truth.
You don't know why people do things. Most of you don't know why you do things. You certainly don't have the right to judge somebody else. And so, when it talks about discerning what the problem is, you need to consider this. Have you taken an offense over something that no offense was intended? And you know what? I think that happens a lot. I think that we pass judgment. I think that somebody does something and you get hurt and offended when the truth was there was nothing to be offended about. There's a lot of people that are so offended that you are passing judgment and taking offense when no offense is intended. And if you would just be honest and do what the Word says right here, and before you begin to start criticizing somebody else because they haven't talked to you, maybe you would go to God and say, God, have I taken an offense? Do I know why this person did what they did? And if you would just go and cast your care about it over on the Lord, you'd find out that many of the things that you're taking offense over aren't even worthy of dealing with.